Good morning. I am not doing an Ignite presentation, since I'm going to be up here for like an hour, and that would just be way too many slides. But you do get to start with a picture of my cat, because all presentations have to include a picture of my cat. What I wanted to talk about today, and this is the first time I've given this presentation in this format, so it's probably still a little bit rough, but I'd like to kind of leave some room for discussion and so on as well. What we're seeing now is that there are probably as many different ways to implement digital automation or business automation or whatever you want to call it as there are companies doing it. So you can have like some sort of all-in-one vertical solution, which might not be very flexible. You can have a single vendor platform, which is usually you're working in some sort of proprietary walled garden, which is great for building applications, but you might be constrained to using their tool set. Or you can start to look at building your own digital automation platform. And this is the thing that I'm seeing with some of the larger enterprises that I'm working with or that I've had a chance to take a look at their operations. Bruce introduced me as an industry analyst, and that's what I do for about half of the time is as an independent analyst, where I look at what's going on, I review products, I write white papers and do presentations and so on. But I spend about half of my time also working with usually large enterprises, often in the financial services industry, to help them with things like technical strategy, architecture, and that type of thing around their digital automation strategies. So that allows me to kind of bring information back and forth between the things I do in a research side and the things that I do in the enterprise consulting side, and see what some of these best practices look like and how they evolve within the company. So that's kind of what I wanted to focus on today. Now, as I said, what I'm seeing with many of these companies, and this is often financial services, that's the kind of sweet spot for me as my client base. It's insurance companies and banks and mutual fund companies and investments and that type of thing, is that they need to have more control over what they're doing with their digital automation. So they're tending to build their own platforms in-house. These are the companies that have built their own core business processes in-house as well. So there's a tendency to have large development groups internally that can build these kinds of things, but we need to provide them with some kind of leverage to be able to do that more effectively. Often the digital automation constructs are a little bit foreign to them, and then also there's a lot of sort of stepping stones that we can provide when they're building these platforms internally. So naturally, as you know, I've been in the BPM industry for a long time, shockingly like 30 years, in what was workflow and imaging and ECM and BPM and integration and all of these other things. That's how long I've been designing and building systems in this industry. And I really believe that BPM systems or BPM capabilities will end up at the core of these platforms. Even if a company is building it in-house, there's absolutely no reason for them to build things like core process management or decision management capabilities. So those are going to be part of what we're talking about when building these platforms. But they're also going to want to assemble things from a variety of other sources. They're going to be looking at all of these other types of technologies that we've been talking about yesterday and that we'll see today and tomorrow in some of the demos. And so they need to have a platform that really allows them to piece together these things. And that's where I'm going to get into the microservice architecture. So that I know you're thinking I'm never going to change slides, right? So this is how I'm trying to explain the subhead on my slide here. So what they need to have is this combination of capabilities such as process management, decision management, AI, all of these other kinds of technology building blocks, and then a microservice architecture to piece this together in the best possible way so that it's flexible and scalable and allows them the kind of business agility that they need. So I'm going to walk you through this morning some of the trends that got us where we are today, and then what some of these new platforms and architectures look like. Okay, so let's start with how we got here. And as I said, I've been doing this for about 30 years in this workflow, integration, BPM, ECM, digital automation space, whatever we want to call it today. And one of the things I find is that there are certain trends that come and go, and that we've seen over the years. Now, some of them unfortunately have come and gone many times, and they're kind of hard to kill after a while. But one of these big swings that we see is this swing between monolithic systems and best-of-breed assemblies of things. And what I'm seeing now in these digital automation platforms that are being built by large enterprises is this swing back towards a best-of-breed approach, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit. It doesn't mean that there's no place for monolithic solutions, and I will talk about the times when a monolithic solution makes more sense versus this sort of best-of-breed, build your own approach. But in general, monolithic solutions are not the best thing for maximum agility within an organization. So let's start with looking at the monolith. The sort of original monolith is these monolithic mainframe applications. These were often built internally, and we still see these. It's not like this was just old stuff that was written in COBOL 40 years ago. There's new monoliths being built today inside organizations, or commercial off-the-shelf software that is then so highly customized when it's put into an organization that it effectively becomes monolithic legacy, because the customizations make it so brittle, it's really hard to consider doing any kind of upgrades on it. So there's some reasons why monoliths are really hard to work with, and the big thing is about this agility. And they're hard to change for a few different reasons, these sort of three basic reasons. And this is true regardless of whether we're talking about mainframe monoliths or monoliths in any kind of environment, and I will go on to talk about some BPMS monoliths as well. But the reasons that they're hard to change is that you have no single business owner for the process in there. You don't have one person who said, oh yeah, it's okay to make these kinds of changes to that platform or to that application, because the application is so broad, it's so big, it doesn't have a single person who kind of owns the application. There's no single development team that has a view and understanding of the code base. So when you start thinking about, well, what if we want to make a change to the application? What if we want to make a change in this little part over here? What are the repercussions in other areas of the application? So if you don't have a development team that can understand the scope and the ramifications of changes when you make changes to the application in some way, then people tend to not make the changes. They're afraid to make the changes. And then the third thing is that even if you do make the changes, so you get a business owner to agree, yes, this is a change that should be made. You get developers who say, okay, we understand, here's the scope of what the changes, here we can contain the damage, as it were, and they will make the changes. Now you have to deploy it, and if you're dealing with a monolithic deployment, then you end up having to disrupt the entire environment as you do an upgrade. And then you're probably rolling in some other upgrades at the same time, like operating systems and databases and so on. So you end up in a situation where you've really created a lot of risk around making any single change to what you have. So the dangers of the monolith then is that it's hard to change for business reasons, for understanding the technology reasons, and for deployment reasons. And we're going to see this kind of echoed back and forth. So this is why people tend to work around monolithic systems instead of change them. And you kind of think like, well, why don't they just make a change in there? It's not that hard. Somebody can go in and understand it. It is hard. It's hard because they're complex systems. Complex systems have a lot of interacting parts, and it's difficult to change one unless you can understand how that's going to affect all the others. Well, so then we decided we were going to fix the monolith problem by implementing multi-tier systems and service-oriented architecture. I will pause here for laughter because, of course, this didn't fix the problem. What happened is that we created a slightly different kind of monolith. So what happened is, we brought in these multi-tier, we started with client-server and then went to these multi-tier systems, and it's like, great, let's put these layers in on top. And then when we make a change, it'll be isolated to those layers. And what we ended up with was these monolithic layers where there were very heavy dependencies between the layers. So that if you made a change anywhere, it was going to ripple both up and down throughout the layers. And often we found that the services that were created, so that's the sort of the multi-tier part, and then when we looked at the service-oriented architecture, in many cases we just put wrappers around the mainframe functions. So it wasn't like we built new capabilities or sort of rolled these up into higher level functions. It was just like, oh, well, there's a get customer record call in the legacy application. Let's put a get customer record call on top of that, and then we'll just call that. So we end up with exactly the same problems in this legacy, if you will, this monolith that we had in the mainframe applications. Nobody owns the entire process because we've created these huge layers and these huge monolithic layers. Nobody understands the code, how all those interconnecting pieces can change, because nobody understood the underlying legacy code to any great degree. And deploying creates a lot of problem. We now have, in fact, even a larger potential for destabilization when we're deploying because we have all these different layers. So any disruption anywhere through there can cause problems. So we kind of created, we created what we thought was going to be a better way to do things, and we just kind of shifted the legacy a little bit. Now, there was a lot of tool modernization at the same time, which was valuable, but we kind of created another problem, another problem there. So now we're in this sort of era of, oh, SOA is dead, but everything is microservices. And the thing with microservices, I'm not going to go into the whole lecture on microservices here, but microservices are, rather than just function wrappers like we tended to see with the old service-oriented architecture, is they are intended to be discrete, self-contained business capabilities within a microservice. So a microservice is a single kind of functionality. It can be deployed and scaled on its own. It's loosely coupled with other things around it. So it might have a coupling through process orchestration. So it might be included in a process orchestration. But it might also be in an event-driven architecture. So it's more of a choreography than an orchestration. So you get a much looser coupling between the capabilities. That means you can then swap something out. If you have a new capability you want to add in, or if you want to change one for the other, you can just kind of pull one out and put a new one in, or add another one that's going to provide some new functionality, and then have it listen for the events that are interesting to it. Or if you do use orchestration, then you would have to wire it into the orchestration and redeploy the processes. But it's much sort of lighter weight. And the thing about, when we talk about discrete and self-contained, we mean the whole stack within the microservice. So the microservice is not just some little function point that then calls down into this legacy iceberg that's below the surface. It's everything in there. It's got the business logic, it's got the data, so data persistence, and a lot of other things built in there that were not in our old style SOA type of services. Now that means you have to do a lot more coordination between some services as well. So for example, if you are updating data within a microservice that's in some other system, you have to have messaging that is going to allow you to do that. But you don't have the bottlenecks anymore of some data layer, a monolithic data layer that's like the gatekeeper to update any kind of data. You can now do that with a messaging architecture instead. So we just have more flexible ways of dealing with things, a little bit more complicated in some cases, but it does provide us with something that's much more scalable and more sort of flexible in terms of the capabilities that we have. So the examples with microservices, if you look at like payment or like online e-commerce type of things, you might have a microservice for processing a payment, for example. It's going to go out and process the payment. It doesn't need to know where it came from. It doesn't really need to know what's going to happen after that. It only needs to know it's going to process the payment and then either emit a message or return something that says that was done. Things can be much more granular, though. So if you look at Amazon went totally towards microservices in their own platforms. And if you look at an Amazon.com page when you're on there buying a book or whatever, there's like 150 microservices called from a typical Amazon.com page. So they've really broken this down into quite granular. But microservice doesn't necessarily mean it has to be small. So it can be small, it can be larger, but the key thing is that it's self-contained and it's a business capability, not just a wrapper around a lower level function point. So those are kind of the key things about microservices. So then there's sort of the next thing the third factor in this how we got here story was this whole emergence of the BPM platform as the new monolith, if you will. So we kind of had these, we started out with BPM systems, and I kind of remember these from a long time ago, where they were really just process orchestration and probably some lightweight forms designing, just so you could build prototypes. It might not even be the case that the intention was that those forms would go to production, but that you would have a way to build a complete process and run through there. And of course, the service activities then let you pull in whatever else that you wanted. So process orchestration, choreography wasn't really a thing back then, some lightweight forms design, and service calls to be able to assemble these applications. Now, that sounds really rudimentary, but that was a huge step up from how we had been developing process applications in the past. Before that, we had workflow systems that were really not much more than just state management and queuing systems. They were pretty dumb workflow systems. And so we had to write a lot of code around those for handling everything that might happen, like escalations or timers or whatever. So now those things were kind of built in. We had these, BPMN as a way emerging to do this. So most of the vendors at least implemented some set of BPMN, or BPL in the early days. But then there were some large analysts, and I'm not going to name any names here, who decided that BPM systems should be the be-all and end-all application development program, or application development environment. So then there's this like race for the upper right corner of the quadrant or the wave or whatever, where every BPM vendor started to add stuff in left and right into their platforms. So now it's like, oh, well, we need one of those types of things, or else we're not going to be able to check the box on whether we're a full IBPMS or whatever. So they would either build something internally, they would partner with another company to do that, they might buy a company or OEM something in. So what we ended up with then was a BPMS as a new monolith. Now, it would have had some original capabilities, usually around the process orchestration. Sometimes, depending on the heritage of the suite, it might have been more around integration than the human orchestration, but it was typically around the process orchestration. So very strong in those kind of capabilities. And then there were all these other things that the vendors kind of gathered up to say, like, oh, we need all this other stuff, or else we're not going to make it to that top right corner. So they tend to be much weaker in those capabilities initially. I'm not saying they didn't improve over time, but one of the problems is that these things then became inseparably coupled. So you bought the suite now, and you got the whole thing, whether you needed the whole thing or not. And obviously, there's some issues around that. It's like, we're back to the monolith model again. You might have capabilities in there that you don't need. You might have a different, maybe you have a different rules engine that you're already using inside your organization, and you don't want the one that's provided within the BPMS. Well, you're still paying for it, sorry, because it's bundled within there, and it's just there. And even if you're not using it, it's taking up some amount of cycles just sitting there, and it also means that you're paying maintenance on it and all of that type of thing. So, a lot of issues are around why this new monolith was not really going to work out in the long term. But at that time, when the big analysts sort of defined this as the way that the BPM system should go, there was a gap in the application development space, and that gap was around a lot of the model-driven development. I don't want to say low-code. I'm going to say model-driven development. So the model-driven development that we wanted to do to be able to create applications much more quickly was just not there yet. And so it was perceived that these suites would be a good fit into that void. That was true at the time. I don't believe that's necessarily true now. There are a lot of other environments, there are a lot of other application development tools that would allow you to do those things that were sort of shoehorned into the BPM suites. So were this happening today in this current environment, it probably wouldn't happen the same way, but I'm trying to give a little bit of historical perspective on how we ended up here. Now, the last thing in this history lesson is not about technology per se, but it's about how businesses changed. So it used to be that when you were doing your business, you're doing the same business that you were 10 years ago, or if you were an insurance company, probably 100 years ago, you were doing business in exactly the same way. And your business was not, it didn't matter how quickly you could change your business models. It mattered how well you were serving your customers. It mattered, how stable were your systems and so on. But then, we hit the internet age, and we hit all of these new business models, all these new ways of doing business. So all of a sudden, there was some, if you were an insurance company, there was some upstart player who could have an app on their customer's phone where they could just like snap a picture of the damage on their property and they would get their claim processed right away. So there were all these things around being able to change the customer experiences in order to stay competitive. So the customers were now judging businesses on different things, not just the old ways that they looked at these businesses that they dealt with, but also around the business agility and the business models. So agility really became a competitive differentiator, business agility, and that requires technical agility. So you have to be able to change your front-end customer experiences really quickly. There's an app for that. But then you also have to change your back-end processes to introduce more automation. Because if you're going to have a customer snap a picture of something on their phone and have that become a straight-through process in your back office, you need to have those back office processes automated. You can't have people sitting there, typing in the results from a paper form that they got in the mail. That paper form doesn't exist anymore. So we have to have new ways of doing both the front-end experiences and the back-end processes. We also have to be able to incorporate in new capabilities. So now you have companies who could barely spell AI, and now they have to have predictive models in their processes to say what's going to happen next. Or they have to be able to incorporate in Mechanical Turk in order to do some small-scale processing or in their as a part of their orchestration. Or there all kinds of things that they never thought of, and that the BPMS vendor never thought of either as being a core part of this platform. So we really need to be able to bring in all of these different things, and it's not so easy when you have this monolithic architecture. So you could have a BPM system that allows you to do some of these things, but you're going to run into those same problems that you do with a monolith. It's going to be harder to change, it's going to be harder to deploy, and you also find, I'm going to talk about this a little later, the selection of a BPM system as your primary application development environment presupposes that process orchestration is at the top level of your application. And that's a problem for some development paradigms. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so that's the history lesson. Now I can start the presentation. So we really want to look at, as I mentioned before, we still need those core capabilities of processes and decisions for that matter. So process management, decision management, these are pretty key capabilities that were really fostered within the BPMS environment. So BPM systems, as they grew, really made sure their process management and their decision management were really strong. And we've had standards emerge around that. And those are those are like the table stakes for playing if you're a BPM vendor. But we want to look at more than that. We want to look at being able to not necessarily let our monolithic BPM system run the show, but still include the capabilities that we might get out of a BPM system, such as the process management. So I'm using the term digital automation platform here. We heard a couple of other terms yesterday. I think intelligent automation platform, business automation platform, digital business platform. I'm going to assume these are mostly synonymous terms here. So just don't call it a digital transformation platform, please. I think we're over that term. Now, I think it was Forrester that started to promote the digital automation platform term. So I've just kind of used that one. And DAP is kind of a nice acronym. So I like the DAP acronym. So I'm going to define a digital automation platform in the way that I'm seeing it within these large organizations that I was talking about. So these are big companies who don't want to use a monolithic application development environment, don't want to use a BPM system as their primary application development environment. They need to have more business agility and the technical agility that underlies that in order to do what they need to do. They have very competitive core business processes. They probably developed their own core business processes themselves. So they need to have a little bit more in there. So what's then in this DAP, in this digital automation platform? First of all, is we're talking about a collection of microservices. But the idea is that this is not a static collection of microservices. This is likely with a digital automation platform, when a company first decides to deploy one internally, is they're going to have a set of microservices where they're like, okay, we're using this for process management and this for decision management, and here's how you're going to build new microservices, and then here's some microservices that are already packaged and are part of it. So there will be microservices in there already, but it doesn't mean that it's static. So if there's something new that comes in, there needs to be that ability to swap out one of those microservices for something else. So the platform is not about being that initially defined set of microservices. It's about being the kind of capabilities that are needed to build the automation applications that are being built here. So these are, a whole set of microservices for automation, creating automation-related capabilities, loosely coupled so that you can deploy them and scale them independently. You might find that there's one particular function that grows faster than others, and you don't want to have it tied to some deployment package where you have to scale up a whole group of services just to get one to have more scale either up or out geographically, if you will. And then the idea that they're swappable for best of breed. And this is really the key thing here, is that it's not, like I said, this static set of you will always have these same microservices, but here's a set, but bring in other ones as long as they adhere to the microservice architecture, the architecture principles. So it becomes almost a set of best practices and some ways to get started with that. Now, there will always be some kind of API surface in here. So this is for developers that are using, technical developers that are using some other development environment for them to be able to come in and consume these microservices through, typically RESTful APIs. But there might also be low-code tooling that sits on top of this. And that's, you'll notice I have that as kind of an optional thing because many companies don't kind of think about that as being part of the digital automation platform that they're building. Some of them do, and there are some that I've worked with that want to build that low-code capability themselves on top of this, on top of their platform. But usually they're thinking about serving the needs of the technical developers who are building the core business processes. So this is really for your, this is for your core stuff. This is not for your administrative processes. This is not for the citizen developers. This is really focused on supporting the technical developers. So the key, one of the key characteristics in here, and I sort of talked about that with the ability to sort of swap things in and out, is the adaptability. If this can't adapt, if you can't bring in new capabilities and create new capabilities within here, then this just becomes another piece of legacy. This becomes the next monolith. So do this wrong, you have another monolith. Do this right, and you have an ever-changing platform that you can use on an ongoing basis. And that's, I think, the hard thing, because we we kind of get tied into doing things in a certain way. We get connected to certain services. It sounds weird, but we get sort of our heart with certain services is like, oh no, we have to use that for vendor services, or we have to do this particular way of doing things. We have to always be open to adaptability in here so that we can bring in these new capabilities. So what does this look like in practice? And as I said, I've been working with a few organizations on designing and building these things on their own platforms internally, and I've looked at a lot more from companies that are doing this kind of thing. So here's the kind of capabilities. First of all, we're talking about these best-of-breed microservices that could come from anywhere. They could come, maybe they all come from one vendor initially. Maybe they don't. Maybe they come from a variety of vendors. But these are properly structured microservices, as I was talking about before. These are discrete, self-contained business capabilities, not just function points down into some sort of bottleneck down below. You don't have things like a data layer in there. That doesn't exist anymore because we don't want to have the bottlenecks that would allow us, or that would prevent us from scaling as we move this out into potentially larger geographies or scale up in size. So that's kind of the key things is these are properly structured microservices. And they can come from anywhere. They could be built in-house. They could come from different vendors. They could be like randomly selected from a cloud provider for a one-off thing. But as long as they follow the microservice principles, then that's okay. They can play in the sandbox here as long as they can do that. Now, the second thing you want to have is tooling for building microservices in-house. And this is where the process management and decision management and these other kinds of capabilities come in. So process management itself is not a microservice. You might have it split out so it could be included in a microservice, for example. But it's not a microservice because it's not really a business capability. Think back to what the business is trying to do. That example I had of a microservice is like process of payment. Well, process of payment probably has some process orchestration in there, probably has some decision management in there, might have some other things going on in there. But it's not just a direct port into a BPM process management capabilities. So you want to have the ability then to have in-house developers create new microservices that they might use themselves then or make available to other developers within the digital automation platform. So that means then if you're doing, for example, process management within a service, you have your process payment microservice, you might have a self-contained, full state engine BPM capability, a process orchestration within that service. It would not necessarily be a call to some broader scale BPM platform that you're using. It might just be a self-contained process orchestration that spins up, does the process you need, and then spins down again. So on demand, scalable, because you're invoking it as you need it. So more like the function stuff that we see on AWS. So these, not exactly a serverless function, but really the idea that you're separate from this sort of broader concept of a server. And that's the thing that I think most organizations have a hard time getting their heads around, is what that tooling looks like for building microservices in-house. This isn't just saying like, oh, here's our digital automation platform, and it's got a BPM system in it. It's like not good enough, sorry. We have to be able to look at how we use that to build new microservices. So we need to have some other things in there. We have to look at security, identity management, that type of thing that are done on a corporate level. So we probably need to plug into some corporate identity management services and those types of things. That's kind of, again, it has to be kind of built in there in the same way. You don't want to be building that in every microservice, for example. So the sort of security by design, privacy by design kind of things. And then we need to have support for not just orchestration-based applications, because this is what happens when we put a BPM system at the top level of as controlling our application development, is we end up with applications that all start with process orchestration. It's like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we want to have more than just being able to do orchestration. We want to be able to define applications that maybe are event-based, so they're more of a choreography than an orchestration. And a lot of BPM systems don't really provide that as a sort of a top-level paradigm for creating applications. So that's the kind of thing that we want to be able to build in these platforms. Now we may also, so these, all of these things so far have been about how we support the technical developers. Then we may also have something to support the non-technical or the semi-technical citizen developers. So this could be some low-code tooling. It could be just configurable applications, like here's some standard case management-y checklist type applications. You can take that and you can sort of build your own little checklists in there. That covers like a broad range of the administrative type process functions or process applications that are built by citizen developers. So you could probably build some stuff on top of this that would cover quite a wide range of what you want citizen developers to do. It's not going to be everything, but you're probably going to take care of many of the spreadsheet and email type applications that you have out there with that type of thing. But again, that's optional. Maybe you want to provide some different type of low-code tooling that they would use that can then connect into that API surface that you have inside the dApp. So this is, like I said, what I'm seeing kind of emerging within companies that are building their own. Now, I mentioned earlier that you might not want your BPMS to be your DApp, or even your application development platform. And I realize I'm waiting for like some things to get thrown from some people in the audience. But the problem that we have is that you're looking at now a proprietary low-code application development platform. This is great for citizen developers. Citizen developers love it, but they're typically not the ones that are creating your core business processes, your high volume core business processes like we see in large organizations. That doesn't mean it's not useful. It doesn't mean that they can't build a lot of really cool applications that are very useful within the organization. But for a technical developer, death by properties panel. Remember, so all of you who were like old coders like me, and the first time you saw something like, Visual Basic, I realize I'm dating myself here, but Visual Basic, and it's like, oh my God, you have to do what to make it do what? And so there's this disconnect between the way you think of, when you're a developer, the way you think of sort of the flow of the code and how things get done in a low-code environment. Doesn't mean that low-code is bad. It just means that there are use cases for doing things in more traditional coding environments that aren't constrained by the low-code. I had an interesting conversation with the development team at a customer not that long ago, and we were talking about why or how they might create a low-code environment on top of the DApp that they were building or that they are building. And we're going through some of these capabilities, and one of the developers who I had didn't know, like no skin in the game here, and he looks at it and he's like, "Oh, that's great," but he said, "We'll never use that." And that's exactly the problem, is that if you put in the low-code application development environments, great for certain types of developers, the citizen developers, great for certain kind of situations, like doing prototyping or situational applications where you don't want to spend a lot of time writing hardened low-level code. But a lot of developers are going to be like, yeah, I just don't want to do that because I have to jump through these hoops to be able to do a bunch of things over on the side here that have to be done anyway. It's not like they're just saying reject it because it's low code, but there will be some capabilities that have to be developed in core business processes that you just can't do in the low code environment. So if you're going to have to jump through hoops to do that, they think like, oh yeah, I'm just not going to use that. I'm going to go back and just write code in a traditional environment. What we want to do with ADAPT then is provide those support tools for technical developers to be able to build those applications without going out and writing every little thing themselves. But back to the issue of why we might not want to have our BPMS as our DApp. So definitely, this low-code development environment. There's things, and I mentioned this on the previous slide, is there's having a BPMS as your application development environment presupposes that you're going to have process orchestration as your template, as your application template, if you will. So most applications in a BPMS start with either drawing a process model, so you're doing like a full-on process orchestration, or they start with more of a data-driven, but there is a little bit more of a milestone-based, but it's still a simple workflow, an orchestrated workflow under the covers. So you have some assumptions then, by using a BPMS, you have some assumptions about the style and place of process within your applications that might not match what you actually need to do for some of your more complex applications and processes that you do. So again, really good for many, many use cases, but doesn't fit everything. It's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And definitely for core processes, that's where we run into these more complex scenarios where things can be a problem. And I mentioned how we want ADAPT to have the ability to create microservices, and that's something that typically you don't have within a BPMS. So what you can do in many, many BPMSs is you can create a process that exposes a service endpoint. So you can invoke a process as a service, but that's not the same as it being a microservice, because when you invoke that process, it runs on a shared BPM platform. So you're not spinning up, and typically you're not just spinning up a new instance for that. So you don't have the scalability. You've now made your BPM platform your scalability bottleneck in that sort of capability. So although you can expose them as services, they're not properly contained microservices. And that's a key thing if you want to have processes that can scale up really big. Now, if you're looking at internal administrative processes, you don't worry about that. It's not like, okay, how many vacation requests are we going to get? It's not like that number is going to explode to 10,000 times what you had last week, unless a lot of people want to go on vacation. And you also, if you look at what developers need, you might lack some things that allow you to do software engineering best practices. So you might not have proper versioning. You might not have proper source code control. Things like being able to diff between source code versions. You might not have automated testing tools that can push through things on a granular level or a larger level. And these are the challenges that I see with some of my customers that are using a BPMS and trying to have a technical development team use it in ways that they, in these sort of proper software engineering ways, and they're just things that they can't do to make sure that the code is maintained in the proper fashion. So those are the kinds of things that we can run into. Again, doesn't mean BPMS is bad and microservices is good or anything like that. It just means we have to think about what are the situations where you use one over the other. And that's what I want to look at then. So I want to finish up by looking at what this looks like, how we can divide up the market, and then I realize it's mostly vendors in the room, so maybe a little bit of advice for you with how you position your products, and for the 3 customers who will watch the YouTube later, a little bit of advice for customers as well. So let's start out then with not marketplace division so much, but more about, it's not like we're seeing some things in the marketplace already, but more about how this gets or can get divided up or how it gets done within organizations. So now I said earlier you might not want to use a BPMS as your DAP, but there's situations where it works as that. So small to mid-sized companies, they might have a commercial off-the-shelf system like an ERP system or Salesforce or something like that managing their core processes. They're not trying to implement their core business processes in the BPM system, or their core business processes are small enough and sort of well-contained that they can do that without having a lot of agility problems by using a BPM platform. They're not going to have the kind of scalability issues that a large organization might have, or the technical agility problems. So there's certainly a lot of scenarios where this makes sense. They have less legacy, like I said, smaller core systems. They have less ambitious development teams, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not like the people aren't smart, but they're not trying to build everything themselves, which is what you do find within large organizations, is that they have very much a tendency to build a lot of things themselves. And what we can look at then is using the BPMS as their DAP for things that are around the core processes or things that are administrative processes that are non-core. So let's say they use Salesforce for managing their core processes. And I'm talking with a few customers right now. And there's one vendor I was having a discussion with a couple weeks ago that does things as a Salesforce add-on and looking at how you position that in the marketplace. And it's like, well, that's great, because Salesforce is an amazing platform, but there's some things it doesn't do very well, and one of those is sort of complex process management. So if you're following things through Salesforce in a certain way, it works really well. If you want to go off script and do some things like some sort of exception processing, maybe not handled very well in there. So let's say you put BPM capabilities alongside Salesforce so that when you have an exception in Salesforce, you're going to spawn out a case or a process on your BPM system that rests alongside and integrates with your Salesforce instance to handle that and then come back when it's done. Perfect sort of way to integrate a BPM system as an automation platform alongside a core system. Same for an ERP system. You have an ERP or an HR system or whatever you have. You might have like an SAP system or whatever. Certain things not done that well by the platform, but you're not trying to replace the platform. You just want to augment it. You want to put a few things around the side so that you don't have those email and spreadsheet type processes that go on when something can't be done in the core platform. Those are great sort of applications for using a BPMS as a digital automation platform within these kinds of companies. Or, as I mentioned, administrative processes. It's like things within your HR department, things within, just managing low volume, internal kinds of processes. In a large company, you can also do that for non-core processes. So you might find that you're using a couple of different things for process management inside large organizations. And if you've ever done business with a large financial company, you'll know they have like no less than 5 process management platforms in any one company. So it's kind of like choose the one that works best for the given environments. So they might have a BPM system that they're using for certain types of non-core processes, and then something more like a microservice DApp for their core processes. And that's perfectly fine. You're not necessarily going to do everything on the same platform. By using the BPMS as a DApp, you get things like that low-code application development environment out of the box. So your citizen developers can now create the applications that they want that are, again, not core applications, because those tend to be a little bit more complex, but they can create all those things that they need to do. And there can be a huge amount of efficiency gain and process improvement and business improvement by doing that. So I think there's a great opportunity to look at that. But the microservice type DApp that I've been talking about in the last few slides then this is where we're looking at typically custom core processes within large companies. So again, it could be financials, could be manufacturing, it could be pharmaceuticals, whatever your industry is. These are big companies, and their core processes, one of the reasons that they're building their own internal core processes is because those core processes are a competitive differentiator for them. So they need to be able to change those core processes quickly, add in new capabilities, and it's not just about that front-end customer experience. It's not just about building a prettier app with nicer colors. They need to have core business processes that work the way that can support that business agility that they need to have and can support the way that they want to work. So they need to have much more flexibility and the ability to bring in these new capabilities without having to redeploy their entire platform. So some sort of more robust development that's going on in there. So it comes down to, and I sort of looked at, I was going to do a chart and then I couldn't figure out how the chart would actually look. Maybe if I do this presentation again, you can come back and look at the chart because I'll probably have it done by then. So it's really kind of you want to look at a number of different axes for how to consider this. So you want to look at the size, everything from small to large companies or small to large departments too. Integration requirements. Are these, what do you need to integrate with? What kind of new capabilities do you need to integrate with that might not be part of your platform? What about development requirements? Do you need to have low-code development? Or are you working just with more traditional development environments? What kind of agility do you need? Do you need to be able to change and redeploy in days, in weeks, in months? Is it okay if you just make the change next year? Like, it depends a lot on your business and on what's a competitive differentiator for your business. And then the scalability. And the scalability is a really important one when you're starting to deal with internet-type businesses and internet services. Because, like, for those of you who remember the early days of some internet services, so who was on Twitter at the beginning? Like, besides me, or as Bruce calls it, the Twitter. So for those of you who were on Twitter at the beginning, you'll remember, it was little, sort of came out, as few people were using it at tech conferences, and then all of a sudden there was this explosion of people who wanted to use it. And we had, do you remember the fail whale? So they had a whale graphic. I know you guys are like all now Googling fail whale. But so Google fail whale on Twitter, and they had this whale graphic that was like, oops, something is wrong now. And they didn't call it the fail whale. That was the term that I think we all created a hashtag for it before hashtags existed. So they were not expecting that kind of scalability. And they had not architected their platform for that kind of scalability. And there was a very public sort of thing around how they had to re-architect. Yeah, you're on fail whale now, right? Yeah. So there was this whole thing around how they had to re-architect their platform because it was never built for scalability. And if you think about Twitter as an example, is you're dealing with communication between people. It's not like you can just say, oh, okay, we'll just run North America on this server and Europe on this server. It's like, no, you might have followers from anywhere being able to interact with anybody. So you had some fairly simple capabilities, but you had some serious scalability issues, both in size and geography. Well, that's the kind of thing that can happen when you put a service or selling a product or whatever, and you put it out there on the internet, and you're not built for scalability. So if you aren't architected for scalability, you'll be able to grow up to a certain point. If you have a monolith, for example, then you can scale up, but it gets really expensive really fast to scale up a monolith. If you have a microservice architecture, you can scale up much more inexpensively, because only the parts that need to scale up, you have this elastic scalability, and only the services and the capabilities that need to scale up will scale up. And then the rest, that don't need to, they'll stay at lower levels. So that's why you want to think about this flexibility if you have the external facing kind of capabilities where you don't have control over how much volume is flowing through your system. So scalability is a pretty key issue with these kinds of systems. And with a traditional BPMS is you can have scalability, because you can have things like, oh, well, it'll just go over multiple servers and all this kind of stuff. But you have expensive monolithic scalability. A microservice architecture gives you that inexpensive piecemeal scalability that you really want to have to be able to support sudden loads in certain areas. So what are the lessons then? And I realize, it's almost, I think it's all vendors here in the room, or pretty much. So what are the lessons that we can have? And the first one is that we are seeing this pendulum swing, or I'm definitely seeing this pendulum swing from buy back to build. So from the monolith back to more of an independent microservice style architecture. And that's for certain parts of the market. As I said, there's these sort of divisions within the market. Depends on whether you're talking about internal or external applications, if you're talking about core business processes versus administrative type, and so on. But for those large-scale core business processes that are a competitive differentiator for a company, we're really looking at things going back towards a build scenario. And those build scenarios are not build from scratch anymore. They're build on top of some sort of microservice base, because it gives you those shoulders to stand on so that you can build quickly and bring new capabilities in quickly. So we need to look at how you can separate things out for consumption. And this is not just a matter of saying, oh, well, we can just price our, no disrespect, but this is not just about pricing your services to say, well, if you only use these services, then that's all you'll pay for. But it's about being able to scale those services. In some cases, you're dealing with the vendor-based clouds, you might not care as much about scalability, but if you're on your own managed cloud or hybrid or on-prem, or, and I haven't even talked about sort of deployment cloud stuff, but, assuming that you might be paying for some of that scalability, you don't want to be scaling a monolith just to get access to one service. So definitely the ability to separate these components out so that they can be consumed by other environments is an important part here. And then the last one, and this goes back to what I was talking about, is one of the key capabilities within ADAP, is that ability to create microservices using your tools. So not just service endpoints into your BPMS that would go into a common BPM platform, but actual self-contained services that could have process management, decision management, whatever other kind of capabilities you have those bundled within as, almost as if they were serverless components within the microservices. And that's kind of an important shift in probably how you build your products, but also how you sell your products to your customers, the people that you approach with this, and how they get plugged in. Now, I find that some of the open source vendors are starting to do this already because they're coming from a place where they're not trying to do everything, and there's more about open standards and so on in there. So we're starting to see some things from some of the open source or open source based vendors that are working into this, being able to have their tools be used in the creation of microservices. But I think we're looking at relatively early days in some of this stuff. So lastly, just want to look at for the customer organizations, so these are the people that you might be selling to, what are the things that they're looking at? And the first thing is that if they've got a monolithic core business system that they're using, their ERP system, Salesforce, whatever it is, they're happy with it, great, don't touch it. It's not like you want to pull that out and just like, ooh, hey, everybody should do microservices because they're cool. It's like, no, if you've got something that works, then do it. But they probably don't have the kind of dynamic elasticity needs in terms of scalability that a larger company might have with their core business processes. What they might need to have is look at how they can augment the processes around there. Like the example I was saying earlier, where you might have Salesforce and then use a BPM system for handling exception processes around there. And that likely has the scalability that are required. As soon as they start looking at externally facing systems where you don't have control over the scalability requirements, over the volume requirements, then all of a sudden those processes start to look more like the big company processes, is in that you need to have that level of dynamic scalability and the ability to plug in a lot of different capabilities. So then they'll start to shift more towards the microservice dApp. Large companies, for sure, this is what I'm seeing, is that a microservice architecture is really essential for the kind of flexibility and scalability that's required. They need to have that now, and this is what they're building internally. And it's, had a bit of an interesting discussion online as I blogged a couple weeks ago about what I was going to be talking about here, and I had a vendor who of course, has a monolithic system, came and said like, oh, no, it's like building rather than buying, that's like a recipe for disasters. These customers don't know how to build that stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, you're not going to take every company for every use case and say, oh, just build it from scratch because that's the better way to do it. That's not the better way to do it in many, many cases. But for these core business processes that require a high degree of flexibility and the kind of scalability you need, that it probably is a much better fit in there. So that's where we start thinking about this, moving to this microservice model for building a dApp. So that's, wow, can't believe I'm actually kind of on time here. So, just wanted to thank you. I can't believe we went through an hour of this. You guys are still mostly awake. Definitely, I know we have a break after this. I'm happy to take any questions now, or if you want to get me at the break or any time, I'll be here right through end of day tomorrow, and we can talk about this more. But thanks very much for your attention.